Well, here we are, folks. Another exciting Tuesday evening and another conversation to have about, you know what, property and related issues. A lot to talk about tonight, and I've got Meighan Wells ready to come in just a moment or two. Very, very significant conversation. We tried to have this conversation a couple of weeks ago, but we ran out of time, and I wanted to give the rental sector a fair go. So that's why we're talking about it today. However, just before we do that, a couple of things to do. I guess the first thing we should just say the doggy can's on. So there you go. The two dogs are there and asleep. I took them out earlier on and absolutely soaked. We've had rain here the last few days like you wouldn't believe. So they're now sound asleep, which is probably where they're going to stay most of the evening. I've been playing around with some of the different. That's interesting. That didn't quite work the way I expected. Let's go back to there. Okay, there you go. Yeah, been playing around with my buttons, and obviously I've got some more work to do there. Just trying to play with a few different angles. Let's try that one. There you go. Just because I can, really. We'll go back to there. Anyway, I think that's enough intro. A few people on already, a few more coming on, I know, and a very important show. So let me just run the intro, and then I'll bring the show back in just a second. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 24th of May 2022. Those of you who watch the show each week will know I keep defaulting to 2021. I'm a year out of date. Sorry about that, but I got the right one tonight. Anyway, welcome to Tuesday evening's live stream. And tonight we're going to talk about the dilemmas around renting. There are so many to explore. Just before I do that, I will just remind you, as I always do, that we don't provide financial legal advice on the channel. The stream is moderated, so just be aware of that. As at the 24th of May 2022, if you're watching in replay. If you want to get my attention to ask a question, use @WalkTheWorld. That makes sure that I see you in my queue. I've also enabled Super Chat. And if you want to get your question to the top of the list, you can use Super Chat to do that, or indeed make a contribution to cover some of the costs of what we do here. Anyway, without further ado, let me push this button and bring Meighan in. Meighan, hello.
Good evening. How are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you going?
I'm very wet up here in Brisbane, to be honest. It hasn't stopped raining, except for about 3 hours today, which was magnificent.
Yeah, you forget what the sun's like, right? And how it dries things out.
Old, it's horrendous. Oh my goodness. And it's relentless. It really is.
Yeah, well, we should send a message to somebody to say, can we have some nice weather, please? I want my summer.
I don't know what happened to summer.
No, I don't.
Anyway, we live in beautiful Queensland, where it's beautiful one day and perfect the next.
Yeah, okay, well, that's
Apparently.
Good. Apparently. Well, look, thanks for coming back on, Meighan. And this is a really important conversation. It's one I've been wanting to have for some time, because I get a lot of questions from those who are renting now, those who are contemplating renting, those who are trying to trade off renting versus buying. And it's a blooming complicated set of questions, isn't it? So what I think we should do is tackle a little bit of contextual stuff first, back into it. And you might just give yourself a bit of an introduction for those who may not know what you do, because every time I tried to do it, you add more things to your pantheon of activities.
Well, tonight I'm going to give you 3 truths and a lie, so I'll let you work out which one's which.
Fair enough.
So I'm a partner in a buyer's agency called Property Pursuit in Brisbane, and we've bought over 20 years we've bought about 800 properties worth about $800 million, and that's a really interesting thing to watch over a long period of time, what changes and what trends are and so forth. Also a partner in a property management business, so we actually have hands-on experience with people who are renting, with investors and so forth, and got to keep pretty close to the legislation on that. So I have a really, really strong interest in the impacts of what a lot of things are having on people who rent, and the people who own the properties that people rent from. And then together with Veronica Morgan, who you have on the show regularly, buyer's agent in Sydney, Veronica, we created, I guess, a service or a course, if you like, for first home buyers, downloaded our brains and really just wanted to help people get into their first home without making diabolical mistakes or suffering from analysis paralysis. And of course, that's never been more important than it is now. And sometimes the question for people is, do I rent or do I buy? And that's such an important question that is no one can answer except yourself, and don't let anyone tell you that anyone else can answer that question for you. And finally, of course, I'm 21 years old, so I've done all this in a very, very short period of time.
I can't work out which of those is actually not true. Excellent. Well, let's talk a bit about the whole concept of renting, right? And it's worth actually just reflecting on, we've got a greater proportion of the population living in rented accommodation than we ever have had. It's almost up to 35% now. And
it's sort of traditionally sat around that 32%, hasn't it? But
correct.
It's just been increasing progressively.
And in fact, if you look at the mix, we've got a shrinkage in the number of people who actually own their properties outright, a growth in the number of people who are mortgaged, right, and into old age with mortgage, but the growth in the rental sector is the astonishing part of it. So that the whole idea of, allowing people to buy their own homes and get into the market, well, whatever people have been doing over the last 20 years, it's not worked because we've got more people renting.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've gone, there's been so many pressures that have been placed on the property market from all different angles, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but it really goes back to about 2015 and some of the decisions that were made during that time, and policy and procedural changes that have happened along the way, as well as unexpected X factors. So there's an awful lot that's impacted, but there was about, at the last census of the 10 million households in Australia, about 32% of those, or 2.6 million, were renters. And most of those were renting from the private sector. So a very small percentage are public housing. It's about 3.7%, I think, of at the time of the census of public housing. So that's where you might rent from either a state or territory government. But most of that rental supply comes from private investors. You and I, whoever it is that owns an investment property, they actually supply that rental market, and a large majority of those renters are actually under 35, so they tend to be in that sort of upscaling, upwardly mobile kind of, or have been long-term renters. So there's quite a spread of ages when you break it down, but a large percentage of people are under 35 who are renting, but I think I looked at a figure today that about 1 in 5 people in Australia own a residential property that is not their own home. So there's still a good percentage of people who are investors. But I would say that if we ran those figures now, it's actually less. I think we've seen a dry up of supply in the rental market.
We'll get the new census data in about a month's time, right? And that'll be very interesting. I'll be spending quite a lot of my time in the subsequent few months taking that data apart, because it gives you a really good baseline to understand what's gone on, and particularly looking at, what happened last time and what happened now. But I'd also make the point that in my surveys, I see a lot of older people who are still renting. So they actually never got into the property sector at all. And there was some research done some time back that said, well, if people who are renting and never get into the property sector and don't actually own property at all, when they go into the sort of the later stage of life and into retirement, they actually struggle because they don't have the income to support
the rent. They don't have the asset and the income. Yeah. So their housing options are actually really quite depleted.
Exactly. So, whilst this is a sort of a conversation partly for youngsters, I think there's a very important thematic too to think about the whole life journey. And for many people, the property acquisition route is pretty much non-existent now because of the price of property and everything else. And the
difficulty in getting lending.
Yeah.
There's a number of factors that go into this, and it's not just prices in and of themselves, but the lending environment has become so terribly difficult as well.
Yeah, and you took the words out of my mouth. If you look at what you can get now compared with even 3 months ago in terms of what you can lend for, what you can borrow for a particular level of income, it's dropped back quite dramatically. And as rates go higher, that's going to actually continue to get more difficult, which means that probably you're going to see more people struggling with the rental sector.
Yeah, and less properties to choose from.
Right, and I was going to say, what's the story on the demand side of the equation? Because there was a bit of a sort of a hiatus through COVID, but I do see some property investors now deciding to sell and get out on the principle that, well, prices went up, but they're not going to go on going up, and I probably should get out while I can.
The supply side of things is really interesting. And you know, I'm not, so let me disclaimer here. I'm not a stats person. I'm a trends and human behaviour and property and that side of things. So I guess I'm more feet on the ground, and that's why I come to you for the good in-depth statistical analysis. But the effect on supply and demand has been really really interesting to look at, because you almost every time I look at, oh, well, that had an impact on it, I have to go back another couple of years. Oh, and that had an impact. And then I go back another couple of years. Oh, and that had an impact. And it's almost like we need to go back to about 2015 when the property markets in Sydney and Melbourne were racing extraordinarily quickly. I mean, they were just bolting out of getting out of control. And the feeling at the time from a regulatory perspective was, and this is when, we had a Royal Commission and we had APRA come in, and there was some impacts on lending and a decrease in lending to investors. So there was an effort to decrease the number of investors in the marketplace, but it actually has had such a really big knock-on effect over long term. At the moment, investors are paying about a 1% premium over what owner-occupiers are paying in interest rates, decrease in the amount of lending to investors. Because every time there's a federal election, the last two times there's been talk about abolishing negative gearing. That thankfully wasn't part of this process, and that hasn't had as big an impact. But I guess the thing that leading up to 2020, so let's talk about 2020 as being the COVID era, but leading up to 2020, we're already starting to see a contraction in the supply, or new investors coming into the market and giving more supply to renters to choose from. And during COVID, we saw some tenants who unfortunately lost their jobs. They couldn't make the payments. There was adjustments. There was new legislation that was brought in that assisted people to stay in their properties during that time. So investors had a period of time where they may not have received any income, but they still had to service their mortgages. And if they did take a break from servicing their mortgage because their own situation was affected, they then had to pay that back, but the tenant didn't necessarily have to pay the rent abatement back. So there's this period of time where prices were stagnant, interest rates were still there might not have been as much income. And then we've had this unbelievable, unexpected post-COVID, towards the end of 2020, incredible run on prices. And it's the first time that investors have said, oh, maybe it's time to get out. Maybe this is time to take my money and invest it somewhere else. I don't know where else you're going to put your money at the moment, because you're not going to get anything out of cash. And I don't know, I'm not into cryptocurrency, but I hear that's not going particularly well. But if you cash out of a property, you've got to think about what else to do with your money. But that has actually been what some people have done, is they've said, well, prices are really good at the moment. At that point in time, rents weren't increasing dramatically. And so we've had an exodus of properties from the supply side of things. That was an opportunity for those people who've held property for maybe 8 or 10 years. It might have been part of their strategy to divest at some point in time. But that supply has also been eaten up by expats coming back into the country from other countries that they didn't feel as safe or happy staying in. They've come back into the country and resumed their properties. So maybe moved back into them, or said, I'm going to sell that particular investment property and upgrade to a home that I'm going to live in. So we've had, 1, people taking advantage of things, 2, people actually moving into their investment properties and making them their principal place of residence. Now, when that happens, we've got expats coming back. If I take Brisbane or Southeast Queensland as a particular example, we've also got really high net migration. So we've got this massive massive demand coming in from overseas repatriation, and we've got demand coming in from interstate. But what we're not seeing in Southeast Queensland is the tradition of people growing up here and then moving somewhere else to get their career on track, whether it be interstate to the major cities or overseas to work as an expat overseas. So we're actually not having any exodus of people from the marketplace either. So we've got this massive amount of people coming in, putting pressure on from a demand point of view, and we've got this decreased amount of supply. And I'm talking about established properties, not new apartments that still have a reasonable amount of supply, and that we'll put them into a different basket. But then, so we've got all of that pressure. Put on top of that, floods. So there are quite a number of properties throughout northern New South Wales and into southeast Queensland that are actually out of the rental pool at the moment because they are impacted by the floods, and they're not, either it can't be lived in, or it is so hard to get a trade at the moment anywhere to get properties fixed up so that they can get tenants back into them. So we've got this massive amount of decrease in supply, this huge demand there that's pushing prices up. And we're still seeing 20 or 30 people in inspections on rental properties and seeing maybe 8 or 15 applications, and people so desperate, so in need of getting a property to live in that they're offering well in above what the property is advertised for. And that is pure market demand that's driving that. You can do an assessment of what a property might be worth in the current market, but if the renters say, I'm prepared to pay what I need to get into this, then they're driving that factor. But one of the things that you and I talked about from a supply point of view also is that during COVID, a lot of the short-term rentals, the AirB&Bs, the stays, the short-term rentals, those were turned into longer-term rentals because there wasn't that tourism factor. There wasn't people that are coming to use the short-term rentals. So it was an opportunity for those property owners to put them into the long-term pools. They're now starting to seep back into the short-term rental pools, which takes away the long-term rental opportunities that were there for a period of time. So here again is another factor that's taking supply away from the marketplace. And that's going to increase, I think, as the borders open and as we start to see more tourism come back into Australia. So it's almost like a perfect storm.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's worth saying that pretty much across the country, rents have gone up. In fact, this is SQM's latest data. It's a bit small to see, but
wow.
Basically, other than Canberra, where you can just see the little red arrows going down, basically everywhere else, new asking rents are rising. And in fact, he made a quick comment. Let me just see whether I can find that comment now. I think it's that one. Yeah. Over the past month to 12th of May, capital city asking rents rose by another 1.4%, with a 12% rise standing at 13.8%. Capital's house rents are recording 12-month increases of 15.3%, while unit rents have risen 13.1%. And he went on to say that rental conditions slightly improved for tenants over April, but nevertheless, it was pretty hairy. And it may be, he said, possibly the worst is over for the national rental market. We might be close to that point. Clearly, landlords, though, are still confident that because they listed their asking rents by another 1.4% over the last 30 days. Now, that's an interesting comment from SQM, from Louis Christopher.
Yes, yeah.
Now, that, of course, is new asking rents. And
that's not actual outcomes.
And so that is essentially not all rents in the market, because there are a lot of people already locked into rents, right? And it's actually an interesting conundrum because if you think how the CPI is calculated, CPI includes effectively an estimate of the rent equivalent, right? But that's trying to get at all rents, not new rents, right? So what that means is that the actual official CPI for accommodation, for rent, is much lower. And in fact, I did a show about that quite recently. I'll just put this one up. Unpicking housing costs in the CPI, because the fact is that the CPI understates, to my mind, the true costs of what housing actually is. Of course, partly because for properties it's seen as an investment as well. But even the rents, the rental numbers are delayed, and because people take a rent for a certain period of time, the new rents are a lot higher, right? Well, that also means that we're going to see a very significant kick in inflation in the next few months because the rents are already significantly higher. Those numbers
will flow through.
Yeah. So we know that a lot of renters are getting squeezed, right? And as you say, some people are able and willing to pay over the odds just to get anywhere.
Just to get a roof over their head.
And I've had so many other people tell me stories of they've been one of 50 turning up, to try and find a place. And basically the agent has, choice, huge choice. And so if you are of a particular set of characteristics, you almost certainly don't get a chance to get in. So it's a big issue.
Yeah, it is a big issue. I guess I'd just like to, I sometimes feel incredibly passionate towards the property managers in this equation because at the end of the day, they don't make the decision.
Yep.
And I think we need to be really clear about that is there might be 50 applications and as a tenant, if you miss out, you might be very angry about that. But at the end of the day, it's the owner that makes the decision on who rents the property, not the agent, unless it's an institutional investor. That's and we're going to talk about that a little bit later because you and I both have some interesting thoughts on that. But, at the end of it, that's who makes the decision and there can only be one person rent the property. It is absolutely heartbreaking listening to some of the stories of people who are absolutely desperate to get into a property. And you see some of the media reports on people who are living in cars or couch hopping as an adult with children, just trying to get some sort of stable housing over their head. And I don't know that it's going to get better very quickly because we've still got, in southeast Queensland, we've still got massive population growth here and natural increase, not only just net migration, but natural increase. And as we head towards the Olympics years, there's a lot of infrastructure projects going on, but not a lot in the housing space. But, there might be some supply coming after that, after the Olympics. But there's a lot of population growth still happening. What will be the impact? And this is more of a sociology question than anything else. And when the borders do open, will we as Australians reopen our thoughts to living and working overseas? Because that's one of the biggest net migration impacts has been people who have taken their families overseas to live and work, apart from natural decrease. But that exodus of people from the shores of Australia, will that actually come back, and will that start to create a little bit more of a balanced equation between supply and demand?
Good question, but of course the chances are that Albo will open the borders because they'll be desperate to get growth. And migration is basically the only lever that's going to make a difference. So I'm expecting to see stronger migration than currently planned over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, so that brings more people in.
Yeah, exactly right, which of course...
Not out.
A lot of those people will firstly want to rent as they come into Australia. And interestingly, in New Zealand, they've already pulled that lever. So New Zealand, who's had property prices slide significantly as rates have gone up, they've done two things. Firstly, they've made it easier for migrants to come into New Zealand and to get residency and permanent residency as that for certain groups almost immediately. And secondly, they've actually announced additional first home buyer stimuluses to try and pull more people in. So New Zealand are pulling those levers, right? I'm expecting that we'll be pulling those same levers very soon.
And you would hope that there's a bit of a longer term view to it and a little bit of navel gazing and a little bit of how did we get here, to say some of the policies and some of the decisions that have been made in the lead up have actually caused this problem. And is there an opportunity for us to look at what could be done differently? Because you can't smack an entire country's property market with higher interest rates and tighten lending criteria because two markets are racing. And that's really what we saw.
Right, yeah, good point. So Sydney, Melbourne in one state, Brisbane, a very different state, and
Brisbane was not racing at that point in time. It was
Yep.
plodding along like it normally does
Exactly.
at a fairly even pace. There's a reasonable match between supply and demand. Rents weren't going up significantly. There was a good number of investors in the marketplace in that time that were bringing more supply into the marketplace. And it wasn't until, the changes, 2015, 17, 19, all of these had impacts on the entire property market. And I don't like to talk about markets in entirety. Much prefer more granular sort of level analysis and discussion. But that's what happened. There was a national approach to a two capital city problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's funny how they've done it again. Don't
even get me started on first home buyer incentives and grants. That's a whole other conversation.
We did that last time, right? So we won't go through that. If people want to understand what we think about first time buyer incentives and why they need to be thought about differently, go and watch our earlier show, because we
watched the last one.
Yeah, we did that. I think pretty good justice, and think of what happened through the election campaigns. Very relevant conversations. But let's come back to this renting question. And I had a question. It was actually from the last show. This is from Alison, and she said, "Look, I'm in rented accommodation currently. Right, I can just about manage to make my rental payments. I've gone down to the bank and asked, well, what could I get if I use that same rental payment to pay for a mortgage?" Right? Mm-hmm. And the answer is, I think if I paid the same, I could probably just about afford to get a mortgage to buy a house. Right? But it's quite line ball between the two, right? And she said, the most concerning thing I have is the amount of commitment you make when you go down the mortgage route relative to the rental route, because rental gives you more flexibility, because if the worst comes to worst, you can find somewhere cheaper, whereas you're really locked in on the property purchase side, although you've got something that you own, and it takes us to the heart of the debate about, do you rent, do you buy? How do you think? How do you make the trade-off between those two things? I mean, it's a really complicated question, isn't it?
And it is, and you nailed it when you say, it is a conundrum, and it's very personal, because everybody's circumstances are really different. And whilst it is vastly thought of as the great Australian dream to own your own property, for some people it is not a reality, because they need to be more fluid in where they are, whether that be that they have work that takes them to all sorts of different places, or they have lumpy incomes that they can't always prove to a bank what it's going to be from one day to another. So maybe that lending is a little bit difficult. Of course, one of the major things that prevents people getting into the property market is having to save that deposit. And that is a really, really tough thing to do when you are still living, and I mean living, not necessarily eating avocado on toast. That was the famous Bernard Salt line years ago, wasn't it, about first home buyers? But it is the hardest thing to do. And I think both parties leading into, and we won't talk politics tonight or policy, because there's a lot that's still got to be teased out around that, but both parties tried to have an attempt to solve the deposit conundrum, if you like, by proposing some ways around that, whether that be whoever was a guarantor or whatever the case may be. So what that ends up being will be really interesting, because you have to, that's one, sometimes the trade-off between if I save more money, then my mortgage repayments will be less. So that's because you're borrowing less money. But if I continue to save, how long is it going to take me until I have enough to actually purchase the property, to have the lower mortgage repayments, and what will the prices have done between now and that point where I can actually buy? Will they have gone past me again? So it's almost like sometimes you're kind of running on a treadmill and not sure at what point do you actually pull up and say, either this isn't for me, or I have to make a really hard decision about whether I adjust my price expectations, or I go for I pay some lender's mortgage insurance, or I try and go into this with someone else. But the decision about whether home ownership is for you, there's so many factors that go into it, and they're so very, very personal. And Veronica and I are really, really strong on encouraging people to do this kind of discussion. Certainly seek other people's views, but you have to make these sorts of decisions based on your own personal circumstances and with your own goals in mind. Because I remember we had a student go through your first home buyer guide, and it was only after about the second or third module, she suddenly went, you know what, the light bulb's just gone on. I should not be buying a property. I intend to return to my home, and she was from overseas, so I intend to return to my home in 3 years. 3 years is too short a time frame in ownership. By the time I have my purchasing costs, my exit costs have eroded anything, I'm actually much better renting. So actually the decision to rent can very much be based on what your lifestyle factors are, what your work environment is, what your plans are. And sometimes that is the best decision to make, is to continue to rent. And it brings in this whole idea of longevity in rentals, because the Australian rental market isn't geared towards longevity in rentals. Mostly people have maybe a 6, 12, 2-year lease would be a very long lease. But we don't have the kind of model that we see in Europe, in the UK, where there are institutional investors in property where they're built to rent. These companies own these rental properties, and you can be in those properties for 20 or 30 years without fear of actually the owner selling or moving back into it. We don't have that kind of model here, and it's not particularly encouraged. And I think it is something that we're starting to see pop up, and there's a pipeline of build-to-rent properties. But I think it's something that we need to explore as another source of potential rental properties for people.
Yeah, well, certainly the whole supply equation for rental is not working well at the moment. That's quite clear. And in fact, one of the comments from the chat was, when you think about buying a property, you've got to think about the maintenance of the property and the insurance of the property and the other running costs of the property. And quite often, people don't actually put all of those into the thinking when they actually think about, I can afford this, right? Because if you're renting, the chances are all the maintenance and everything else is being done by the landlord. Hopefully, fingers crossed, right? But suddenly you've got that extra overlay of cost too, and certainly, I've spoken with a few people who started the journey thinking, well, I can just about line ball because I'm going to be paying the same amount, right? But then you actually add the other things in, and then, hang on a moment, this is quite a lot more. And then you say, well, about interest rates, right? You should probably allow for a 3% buffer on interest rates because they're going to go up. Oh, hang on. Well, that then suddenly, and even though rents might be going up, and that's not very pleasant, you could actually be jumping from, something that's not very pleasant to something that's appalling.
Yeah, financially it could be quite devastating, certainly, if you haven't done your research and understand what your costs are and have a decent buffer. And the unfortunate thing is, by the time you save a deposit, and have that 20%, usually you haven't got enough for a buffer as well, because of it, particularly at the moment where the market is continuing in upward direction. You've got to be really careful at that point where you say, all right, well, that's my entry point. If you haven't got a buffer and an unexpected cost comes in, or you haven't done your research effectively and know exactly what your costs are going to be plus your buffer, then you can put yourself in a really stressful situation. And if you're sort of forced into a position where you can no longer afford that property, then your in and out costs may actually be greater than what you can sell the property for in a very short period of time. So it's not a liquid investment. It's not something that you can turn over and sell to anybody very quickly. And depending on where we are in the market cycle, there may not be a buyer for your property in a short period of time. It may take some time to actually find, particularly if it's a B or a C grade property. There will always be buyers for A grade properties, but it is something that is a lot less easy to get out of. Not that a lease, a legally binding tenancy agreement that you enter into, that is a binding legal agreement. But if you do need to do something, then you've only got a period of time in which you have to service that to be able to move on. So it's much less liquid. It is much less mobile, but it has the other side of security and asset. So it's not for everybody. The decision over which way to go is not for everybody, and it takes a fair bit of internal analysis to say, well, where am I in my life cycle? Is having this security more important than having the mobility and the ease to move quickly between properties if I want to?
Yes, and that takes a certain maturity of perspective, doesn't it? And the thing about buying a property, quite often it's quite emotional and emotive.
Very much so.
Right?
Very much so.
Yeah.
And your head sort of rules you, and your heart rules you from that emotional point of view. I want the kids to be able to grow up around their friends and go to the same school, and I don't want to have to be moving them all the time. And I know people who may have moved 25, 30 times in their young life because they were renting, and they just kept, the owner would sell or move out or whatever the case may be. It was just one move after another. If you own it and you're prepared to stay there for a long time, then that may be the right decision for you. There are a lot of extra costs that you need to think about. Even if you have a building and pest inspection and you've got a pretty good idea of where your challenges are, there's nothing to say that there may not be a non-insured event that might happen to the property where something breaks down. Hot water systems. A hot water system can be functioning perfectly well at night, and you wake up and turn on the hot water in the morning, and it is shot. It's gone. There's no way to prepare for that. No one can tell you that's coming up except for you making sure that you've got enough money to replace it if it does go. So that's the kind of unexpected cost. You've got not only the hot water system, but then the plumber to put it in, and if there has to be an upgrade to the pipes and so forth. So it could sort of run on, and they're the sorts of things you can't. No one can prepare you for them, but you have to be prepared for them from a financial point of view.
Absolutely, yes. You need a little bit of buffer so that you've got some. I sometimes say to people, well, think about like a sinking fund, right? So you should put some money away each month, right? Deliberately, because at some point over the next 2 or 3 years, something is going to go wrong and you're going to need it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, some people will say, well, I'll just put it on credit card. Well, that's okay if you've got capacity on your credit card and can afford the higher interest rate if you can't pay it all off. But economically, these are things that can really make a huge difference to your finances if you get them wrong.
Yeah, but if you get it right, then it can be very rewarding.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it can be, you can go into these things with eyes wide open, but you've got to be prepared to put in the work to educate yourself so that you do know what the what ifs could be and where you might come unstuck. And being able to make that decision with your head before you enter into an emotional decision about what does my heart want, then you can make much better decisions. And you can also, a lot of people get into this phase of analysis paralysis of, I really want to do it, but what happens if, and they're in this cycle of, I really want to do it, but I don't, and they're just stuck in this space of, what do I do? And they don't do anything. So also moving you forward out of that paralysis kind of phase is really quite important too, because not making a decision is making a decision.
Yeah, that's worth underscoring, right? You've made a decision, just not necessarily the one you think.
Not making the decision is making a decision.
Yeah, no, that's true. And look, I guess the other point to make is there's always going to be some risk. Any jump in any direction is going to have some risk attached to it. It's not like you can completely live risk-free, right? So it's trying
Certainly
to make
not.
It's trying to make the right.
Who would have thought the GFC was coming? Well, I guess there were indicators, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And who would have thought? Really, honestly, Martin, who really hand on heart thought we would have a property boom after 8-9 months of COVID lockdowns?
Yeah. No. Well, I mean, it's all to do with low interest rates and easy credit. As I've said on many occasions, house prices are very definitely connected to the availability of credit. When credit is available, prices go up. When credit is less available or rates go up, prices.
But there was the emotional factor too.
Yeah,
and I think that's
true.
the thing that we always have to bring into property is
good point.
the emotional factor of COVID was that people were stuck at home and they were stuck in homes that they were probably okay with when they weren't always all there together, and that was short periods of time, after school, after work, before school, weekends. They were really short periods of time. So sometimes the deficits in those properties weren't as obvious as they were when you're actually in them day after day after day after day after day with just a walk around the park for an hour. So that we can't discount that emotional factor. And a lot of what happened post-COVID was people went, we haven't travelled, we haven't spent money on any of those, we've hardly gone out for dinner. We might have got Uber Eats, maybe supported the local takeaway shop by having that occasionally. That was really people's expenditure. But some of the big ticket items that what did we need ball gowns for during COVID? Nobody needed their Jimmy Choo shoes. So it was people who might have spent money on more frivolous kinds of things actually started to have money in the bank, and then they looked inwardly and said, well, actually, I'd really like a house with a pool, or we would really like that extra room, or we're working from home so much now, we really need space that everybody can have some sort of working environment from home. So that emotional factor had a massive impact on people's decision to upgrade their properties. So put into the mix people coming back, population pressures as people migrated, and then locals in different marketplaces saying, I want better. And that emotional decision had actually, it does unplug a little bit of supply from where they're upgrading from, but it actually puts pressure on the next level of the marketplace. So I wouldn't ever discount the emotional factor in property, because at the end of the day, property is about people. It's about the seller and the buyer of the property, and both of those have emotions.
Absolutely. And yes, I left all my ball gowns in the cupboard the whole of the COVID lockdown.
Better check they're not mouldy, because I tell you what, I pulled out a handbag the other day and it was just covered in mould.
Yeah, exactly. Now, Edwin asked a question a little early ago. I'm going to throw it up. In New South Wales, you can get a 5-year rental lease as long as it's vetted by the FTNSW. I'm not sure whether it's the same in Queensland. And then he asked another question about break clauses. Let me just put this one up as well, because I actually, whoops. Yeah. There you go. So that was that one. And do you have break clauses in leases in Queensland, like in New South Wales? So
I'll go with the first question.
Yep.
I don't know who FT New South Wales is, but I'm something tenancy, I'd imagine. There's no maximum term that you can have on a tenancy agreement. It is negotiated between the tenant and the landlord. So I don't know that has to be vetted by anybody. Certainly there would need to be factors in there in terms of rent increases and so forth over such a long period of time. But in terms of break leases, it's sort of a colloquial term, really. What you've signed is a legally binding document. It is an agreement between the owner of the property and the tenant of the property for a payment of a sum of money in return for the tenancy of the property for a fixed period of time. If you're going to apply for early termination of that fixed term agreement, then it is likely that there will be costs associated with that, and you will have obligations as an outgoing tenant for a period of time according to what the legislation allows for in that particular state. So break lease, there's no such thing as a break lease. It is early termination or application for early termination of a binding legal agreement. There may be costs associated with that.
Okay, thank you. And Jason asked this question. Thanks for the super chat, Jason. Hi, Martin and Meighan. Evening, everyone. Hope all well as well. Question for all. If you own all townhouses in a small CTS scheme in Queensland, you can dissolve CTS to save money. Can you convert back to single ownership and consider it one site for rates, etc.?
You can. It depends how it was approved. So it's not. I wouldn't rely on that strategy. And there is greater value from an asset point of view in them being strata titled rather than in one line. So there's probably some pros and cons there in looking at that. And making an assessment as to which way might be the best. So we have, as a buyer's agency, we've bought a number of complexes. Some have been strata titled or have their own individual titles, some with a body corporate, some without a body corporate, and then others have been all in one line. So there's just different ways of doing it, different costs associated with it. Word of caution, if you are looking at those sorts of strategies, is look really carefully about the insurance, because insurance costs can differ between insurers for properties all in one line versus strata title, both from a building and a landlord policy point of view.
Yeah. And I presume
if you're going to sell them and at one point you're going to divest them, have a think about that sinking fund and that body corporate, because when buyers buy individual lots, they're going to look at the history of the body corporate, what the sinking fund levies should be, where the balances are, what maintenance have been done. So have a really good think about your long-term strategy when considering whether to have all in one line or strata titled.
Yeah, no, that's great. And Edwin just clarified it was Fair Trade in New South Wales.
Fair Trade in New South Wales.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Edwin.
Yeah. So in Queensland, it's Residential Tenancy Authority is the legislation under which the tenancies are compliant.
All right. Another question for you. This is from Paul. Again, it was in the last show, but it was one about rent vesting. So the concept of I can't find anywhere that I can afford to live and I want to buy. So what I do is I rent, and then I actually buy something else elsewhere that I can let out. Is that a good strategy? Is it not a good strategy? What are the things I need to think about if I'm thinking about rent vesting?
I think for some people, it's a really legitimate strategy. And if you think back to what I was talking about before about that mobility issue, so particularly for people who may work in different locations or may actually like to live in different places and don't like to put their roots down too long, this actually can be a way to kind of get the best of both worlds, if you like. So one part of it might be that you can't afford to purchase in the location you want to live in. So that might be one element of it. The other element might be that mobility issue of wanting to be, able to live wherever you want, whenever you want, and move around and be mobile. So it is for some people a really legitimate strategy. What it needs to do is to fit into the overall plan. So it's like anything, buying for buying's sake is poor strategy because there's no strategy behind it. But if you've really sat back and you've talked to appropriate advisors, and I'm a massive one for going to the person who is the expert in their field, who will give you the advice that is around you, not what did Dad do, what did my boss do, what did my colleague do, what did the guy that I train with at triathlons do. That's not strategy, that's ideas. And then ideas have to come into, well, what is it that I'm trying to achieve? What's my income trajectory? Where am I going to be working? Where am I in my life stage? All of those factors have to come into both the decision to purchase, to live in, but on the other hand, am I better off renting and having an investment property that kind of gets me into the market, but I don't actually live in? It's so really important. Actually, one of the questions that we get asked a lot with Home Buyer Academy is, what about if I live in it for 6 months and then turn it into investment property? And that might work for some people, if that's a way you want to go. Often people are doing it because there might be stamp duty concessions applied to it or other things. I think the biggest thing to understand is if you're buying an investment property, you buy it with your head, you buy it understanding the numbers, and you buy it based on the quality of the asset and the rentability of it. And you understand how long you're going to own the asset for and what it's actually trying to achieve for you. Don't buy it because you really like and feel comfortable and love that courtyard and you can't wait to have a little puppy out there. So you've got to differentiate between the emotional drivers in that decision, because you're going to live in it maybe for 6 or 12 months, or maybe you're going to live in it before your job relocates you to Sydney or Melbourne or whatever the case may be. So the drivers have to very much be investment focused, not personal focus. Yeah,
because basically it's two sets of laws, isn't it? Right?
Well, it's not. You've got to remove you have to remove the personal laws. They just cannot exist.
Well, the point is they pull in completely different directions. Right? That's the problem, right?
They're two vastly different approaches to buying property.
Yeah.
And if you've got a short-term strategy to live in it. And I know of people who have bought what they thought was going to be investment property and have ended up living there for a much longer period of time than they thought, because whatever it was that was in their plan didn't eventuate or was delayed. But that doesn't mean that you make an emotional decision what you want in a property versus what is a good investment decision if you are buying a property to rent vest.
Yes, and the point there is if you're buying a property for investment purposes, you've got to look at it like a financial transaction, and you've got to actually make decisions based on the financial parameters.
The financial parameters, but also the investment fundamentals.
Yeah.
Because if you make decisions that are not based on investment fundamentals and you haven't actually worked out what your investment goals are around that property with the person who is best placed to guide you as an individual, then you've got to make the wrong decisions. You're going to match the wrong property to the wrong strategy or no strategy at all. So, yeah, vitally important to get that bit of the equation right. Investment fundamentals. Can I say it again? Investment fundamentals.
Underscored, yeah.
No, underscored.
No,
oh, that's my dog having a bit of a yak now.
Yeah, that's dogs are allowed.
Every time the neighbour opens their gate next door, it squeaks, and that she barks like that. She's off.
There's a fantastic question which just follows on. Why are tenants allowed to have dogs in small apartments? It's a disaster for landlords. And, of course, the legislation, certainly in Victoria and areas of New South Wales, has made it...
And proposed in Queensland.
Is that right? Yeah. So what gives with that?
Strong-willed tenants is what gives with that. No, look, there's no doubt that animals form a really important part of people's emotional well-being, and they really came into their own through COVID as people sort of sought to expand their emotional base outside the people in their immediate family, and that I think is a really important factor in personal and emotional well-being. From a property side of things, and I'll talk to Queensland, because there was a case where some property owners in an apartment complex in Queensland were denied permission by the body corporate to have a dog. They had a blanket policy of no pets, and this couple was in a financial position where they said, you know what, we're going to take this on and we're going to take it on for Queensland tenants. Sorry, they weren't owners; they were tenants within a complex, and they actually won the case. So there's precedent there to say that body corporates actually can't blanket refuse for tenants or owners within a complex from having pets. So that actual blanket has been removed. However, it is a difficult thing when you are in, and it's hard to kind of wrap your head around a pet being locked in an apartment all day that doesn't have outside access. There's an element of that just says to me, well, where are they going to pee and do their business, and where are they going to get their exercise? And when pets aren't exercised well, then they often bark, and so that whole thing of when people bought pets during COVID, they were home all the time. These pets had this loving emotional connection and company all the time. And now that people are returning to life outside the four walls, then these pets are, they've got a new reality, which is loneliness. And that can be really intrusive to other people within the complex if those pets are unsettled during their owner's absence. So is it right or wrong? There's a lot of sides to that. The unfortunate thing is you can't absolutely say no. And as you said, Martin, as you pointed out, in Victoria, New South Wales, it's very hard to say no to a pet without a really good reason, and that is part of the proposed tenancy reform proposals in Queensland.
Yeah, a few people were talking about in the chat as you spoke, and in fact, as you made your points, they actually made the same points. It was perfect timing, so it worked really well. Thank you for that.
Right, got it, nailed it.
I must tell you that my experience of dogs is that they tend to bark at other times other than when they when they get bored. Like, and if anybody rocks up to the front door, or if anybody drives past, or anything, it's quite an interesting experience.
Yeah, it is. But the other thing, I talked about the emotional side of that, and mental health and well-being. It's a really, really important part of people's emotional well-being. But it can have an impact on, from a landlord point of view, it's a really grey area, because whilst the legislation might in the southern states say that, well, you can't just say no to a pet, it also hasn't actually given, I think, enough protection to the owners to say, well, if you do have a pet, fair wear and tear looks very different when you have a pet than when you don't have a pet. So, for example, carpets and so forth. So how you judge fair wear and tear as a property manager becomes greyer and greyer when a pet's involved, because it could be argued, well, the pet is part of the family, they're allowed in the property, and therefore, the impact on the carpet and so forth is just part of me having a pet. But if you've got new carpet and a pet has soiled that carpet, it's a little bit clearer in what you can claim from a tenant where that has been an issue, versus if your carpet is 5 or 7 years old and it's just a small part. So it actually creates a lot more area for conflict between property managers who look after an exit process and tenants who have had a pet in a property. So actually, my guess is that we'll actually see a lot more pressure on in Queensland, the QCAT process, which is the process that you go to if there's can't be a mediated outcome between a tenant and an owner, and that it will sit around pets in properties.
And do people have to disclose whether they're going to have a pet in a property? Absolutely.
So you still have to apply for, and you should always apply to have a pet. It's just that the owner can't just straight out say no. It may be that it's an inappropriate pet for the space. Having a German Shepherd in a 1-bedroom apartment without a balcony, one could argue that might be an inappropriate place to have a pet of that size and nature. So whilst it can't be just a blanket no pets policy, there has to be and should be an element of reasonableness of what that is, and in applying for a pet or saying, I'm going to get a pet, this is what I'm thinking about doing, you have a think about whether it's appropriate for the space that you live in.
Yeah, and Jason said, doesn't body corporate by law dictate how it runs, like pets and things? Well, there is stuff that you can do in body corporate, but there are also rules that sit above it, right? So state rules.
So they can't break the rules.
It's
they
how
can't
those
break
interact.
The law. Yeah. But certainly it would be not unreasonable in a high-rise apartment complex. Some of them impose height and weight restrictions on pets, and that the idea being to keep it a smaller size that's appropriate within the complex. You've got to remember, if you have a pet in a complex, you've got to walk them through common areas, and some body corporates can actually say that your pet must be in arms, not on the ground. Right. So you've got to be able to carry the thing in that case.
Right. Gosh, interesting thought. Now,
just an aside, because I like to go off track.
Yeah.
My very first property I bought was in 1998, and it was an old workers' cottage in a north side suburb, Gordon Park, and it was a deceased estate. And I had this romantic notion of raising it up and building and renovating and so forth, and so I did all of that. But in between, saving the money to do the first part of the renovation and the next lot of money being available, I had no stairs. And in that time, in my own wisdom, as a young person, I bought a German Shepherd. And I carried that German Shepherd up and down the ladder from the ground level to the upper level. I really don't recommend that as a strategy. Emotional well-being wasn't great. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, no. They get heavy, and of course they also wriggle as well when you try and carry them, which doesn't
stupidity
help.
at its best. I've learned a lot of lessons over my time in property.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's what it's. If you don't learn from your experiences, that's part of the great tapestry of life, isn't it? I guess.
Make sure you can afford the stairs before you raise the house.
Yeah. Good point. Now, there was a few other things that came through. One of the ones that is quite interesting to talk about is different commercial models around investment property. What I mean by that is build to rent. There's a lot of that going on in and around Sydney now. In other words, big business companies basically building specifically for rental property. And by the way, the research suggests people end up paying quite a lot more in terms of the rents for those types of places relative to the private sector. And there may even be other commercial models that sort of bubble around the edge. And maybe that's a way of looking at this differently in terms of future supply. But what do you think about some of these alternative ownership models? Do you think that should be part of the solution, or is it creating a bigger problem?
Well, I think there's a couple of sides to this, but there is no doubt that we have to start thinking a bit laterally about where people are going to be housed, because whilst it is a great Australian dream to own your own property, it's not a right, but it is a necessity to have a home to live in. You know, there's 115,000 homeless people in Australia, and I would probably guess that number has gone up quite a bit since the floods, because there is so many less properties available in areas where there's a high percentage of rentals. So I think, you know, we've got 300,000 public housing. Can state governments afford to build more public housing? It's probably not the answer. Higher taxes would need to be collected in order for that solution to be increased and improved. There are about 2.1 million private rentals, and that's been probably trending up a little bit since that figure in 2018. But I would actually think if we ran those numbers and could really look at the numbers, that I think we've seen a dip in that number from a private rental point of view. So that's really, you know, apart from owning outright, having a mortgage, renting from a private landlord, which is the majority of rental stock that is available for people, or public housing, what other solutions are there? So we actually have to start thinking quite laterally about this. And certainly corporatised investment is a very strong model in the US and in European countries. So that's where institutional investors, hedge funds and superannuation funds and so forth, that they're building build-to-rent specific properties or investing in established stocks, but often building. So the adding to the supply is part of that methodology. And I jumped on really quickly when we were talking about this earlier, and I found that in Australia, that pipeline is about 25,000 properties that are currently in the pipeline for the build-to-rent market, the institutional investment. And the idea or the philosophy behind those are sort of building communities and cultures and having amenities. And as you say, that often comes at a higher price. So we're not talking about necessarily affordable rental options here, more lifestyle options that are offering alternatives to people who may otherwise want to purchase. These sorts of things can allow for basic modification, so it's a little bit different to a private investor renting a property directly to a tenant. More flexibility around pets and so forth. But I think the thing that this opens up the opportunity to, and we need to debate this quite heavily, is it allows for longer term leases, and by allowing for longer term leases actually adds security to the tenant. So there's some real pros and cons in this, and one of those being security of tenure. As long as you're paying your rent and you're doing the right things and you're not breaching and so forth, then you actually can end up with a long-term home that you are renting from an institutional investor. Whereas private landlords, life interferes sometimes in a way that they don't always expect. And just like we saw post-COVID, when an opportunity is there to sell for a good price when you haven't been making much of a return on your investment property, well, you know, there's an opportunity that they're going to take, whereas an institutional investor wouldn't do that. So it is something I think we need to look at and see if there is some way to bring this more into the way that we look at a solution long term for people who do want to choose the rental option, or who through different circumstances that is the only option available to them.
Well, it's just interesting. Of course, there are quite a few projects underway at the moment and others planned. It'll be interesting to understand the basis of those tenancies, whether they really will be long-term and to what extent the rents will be ratcheted up over that period, right? Because you might have a 5-year tenancy or a 10-year tenancy, but if there were rent reviews every year and they go up 15%, that's not necessarily going to be positive. But
yeah, and what are the mechanisms around that?
Yeah, exactly. I was talking to somebody the other day who actually was looking at one of these and got hold of the draft agreement and was horrified to see that, sure, you could actually agree to take it for a long period, but every year the rent was actually escalated. Right. So,
which would make sense. But then how is that assessed? And if there's, everything doesn't always go up. We went through a period where rents went down because there was an oversupply and there wasn't enough demand from tenants to soak up that supply. So if there's not a capability within those agreements for it to go in both directions, depending on what the market's doing, then you could actually end up in a pretty difficult situation where you're paying well over market rate.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you start from the assumption that it's going to cost more because you've got all these extra amenities to start with, and then you've got these escalators, suddenly commercially, does it necessarily make sense? And also, of course, they tend, in some cases, to be focusing on more affluent people who can afford, to pay more as well. So it may not actually solve the supply of affordable accommodation, because my survey suggests that that's where the real problem is, because as you said earlier on, the public sector's walked away from building and providing public housing for all sorts of reasons. They've sort of left it to Mr. Market. Well, Mr. Market doesn't really care about who has or who doesn't have somewhere to live. Mr. Market is only interested in returns, and so it changes the whole characteristic of the way that the market behaves.
Oh, come on, you sound so cynical, Martin.
Me, cynical?
There are some people who have social conscience as investors as well, and actually do.
That is true.
They do exist, and I know them.
Yeah, and in fact,
fortunate to have managed properties for them too.
Yes.
So I think we can't. It's a bit like real estate agents; you just can't throw everybody under the same bus.
No. But what I was suggesting was that maybe those institutions who are going in for the commercial outcome purely are going to be more directed by those market behaviours relative to private investors and individuals who, as you say, some of whom do have a conscience. I was talking to somebody the other day who's not put the rent up for 2 years and is worrying about putting it by $50 a month. I mean,
there's a care factor there.
Yeah, there is.
And there are people who actually think like that. But if we think about, the old models of institutional investing are, the timeshare and the serviced apartments and the student accommodation. And, there was a lot of hype around these in the last 10 or 15 years, and they just haven't returned to those organisations, the sorts of, and particularly where people were invited to be part of these bigger picture kind of institutional investments and build to rents, they just haven't delivered.
Correct.
And it's because they don't have that, we talk about, Veronica and I bang on about it. If you buy an investment property, you can't just buy an investment property. You need to buy a property that actually appeals to investors and owner-occupiers, because that's where your capital appreciation comes from. So if you're investing in a build-to-rent kind of scenario and they're all the same, they're all kind of cookie-cutter and they're all, aimed at 2-bed, 2-bath, that sort of thing, which we saw quite a bit of oversupply in the major capital cities in the last 10 years or so. There's no scarcity factor to these sorts of things, and the future appeal for owner-occupiers just simply doesn't exist. And that's why student accommodation has performed particularly terribly, because there's no one's going to buy that and go, oh, I'm going to live in that fabulous student accommodation with a bed and a fridge and a shed toilet. so that scarcity factor and that broad buyer appeal just doesn't exist in these types of things. So it's a really tricky one to navigate, but it has to be part of a broader discussion around what are the options to deal with this absolute rental crisis that we're facing at the moment. And that is way more demand than there is supply. And just throwing up some apartment complexes is not going to solve that supply, because it's not necessarily the accommodation that people are looking for. And we saw that with the oversupply of investor-style apartment complexes in the last 10 years or so.
Absolutely, yes. That is extremely important to understand. And there is a crisis in the rental sector. So in my surveys, more than 40% of renters are having difficulty making those rent repayments. That's more than
40%.
40%, right? So that's getting on for 2 million households, right? Struggling, right? And interestingly, it's quite widely spread. So it isn't just in the
in terms of price ranges,
it isn't
geographic.
Both. It isn't just in the outer suburban areas. It isn't just in the very cheap accommodation. There are pockets in various places, and even up in Queensland. Interestingly, the postcode with the worst is actually Victoria, Melbourne 3000. Right.
Oh, right in the heart of the city.
Yeah, and that's because there the prices are actually quite extended. A lot of people are still on more limited hours than they were, and their rents have gone up. So there is a big issue here with just the sheer problem of trying to pay for rental accommodation with everything else going up. The cost of living, etc., etc. And then you overlay this intention to put prices up, and you can see that we've got to find a different model. And look, I was very interested that I didn't see one discussion through the whole of the election campaign on the rental sector.
I think it's too hard.
Yeah, well, maybe it is, but
I think it would have been too hard to open that can of worms when there's just too much consultation that's got to go on around that. That would have probably, killed either party if they'd gone in either direction. But I think there has been some discussion from the independents, and it may be what some of the appeal was in some of those electorates around the independent side of things, is they're prepared to have the conversation around it. And I think that's where we need to be heading, is actually having some conversations with a variety of different stakeholders and starting to say, look, what are some of the options? What are some of the routes? It's not just a re-education of expectations, because there's certainly been an expectation crisis, particularly from a first home buyer point of view of, what I can afford, can't afford. There has to be a realignment sometimes of what's reasonable and unreasonable. But it is not unreasonable to expect to be able to have a roof over your head. And it is absolutely heartbreaking to watch some of these families that are living out of their cars, that are struggling. It's fine to move back in your parents for a period of time while you're between houses, but that's not a long-term solution when you're raising children and have your own family unit and need your own space. So for some people, that isn't even an option to be able to do that. But this has to be a broader conversation with people who have interests in all sorts of different areas, and whether that is in the form of think tanks or collective interests, but there has to be tenants involved in it, and private landlords and institutional investors, and there's even the property management sector themselves have observations on this that would be valuable to a broader conversation about how do we solve this and make sure that there is enough housing for people.
Well, certainly. I think it should have been, and in fact, Edwin makes the point. Why is it too hard? They're politicians, the political parties. There is a big proportion of the population who are completely connected to the rental sector, and I feel that they were very much disenfranchised from the whole debate. Okay, there was money thrown at first-time buyers potentially, right, and that's a few other things. But to me, this was a huge issue that should have been more thoroughly explored. But no, that was too difficult, too strategic. And yet, for me, this is one of the big issues. One of the reasons why I'm featuring on my channel a series of shows about the rental dilemma, because it really is a big, complex issue, but nobody wants to talk about it.
Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it shouldn't have been discussed. I'm simply making the observation it probably would have been too hard for them to discuss.
Right.
Because there's no simple answer. No. And just trying to create a policy that tries to provide a solution for what is a really complex issue that has been created over a very long period of time. This hasn't just happened because of a factor. It's happened because of so many decisions and factors that have all led to this storm of inequity between supply and demand.
Yeah. Well, it's 30 years plus, isn't it, of bad policy and lack of focus, and focus on, as I said, letting the market do the work in an unguided fashion, right, in the context of high home prices and high debt, all those things. But I think we've lost the plot, is what I'm trying to sort of say, is that there's a really big strategic discussion to be had here about how we tackle this fundamental issue. It's a really important issue, and the number of people that I come across who are really struggling with this dilemma. They are trying to get into the rental or get in to buy, and how to, housing is a big issue, and I'm very disappointed personally that it wasn't actually something which people felt that they could engage with. But not that I'm saying it's simple, but in a way that's precisely the problem. There are no simple, straightforward answers. These are big, complicated, economic, social, societal, political, all of those factors all mixed up together.
Yep. And simply building more complexes actually doesn't answer the question, because you have to examine what it is that people need and where they need it. Infill between Gold Coast and Brisbane, it doesn't satisfy what the need actually is, and that's generally for people to be close to places of work and employment. A little bit of a change in that, but at the end of the day, a lot of people are still going to be physically going to work. You've got hospitality, you've got healthcare, you've got frontline, you've got teachers that they physically have to go to work. This whole work from home revolution is for a part of the employment market, not for all of the employment market. So people still need to be physically located where those opportunities and work actually is for them. So it's not even just as simple as saying, let's throw up some complexes in somewhere where there's really good NBN and people can work from home. It doesn't actually solve what the problem is without understanding what the problem is itself.
Well, exactly right. And I'll just put this one up, which I think is quite important. How many houses have been bought by BlackRock and its owned entities? And we know in the US, BlackRock and its other entities have been hoovering up cheap property because it sort of fell down after the global financial crisis, and basically have been put into these commercial structures. Now, so far, there isn't a huge amount of evidence of similar things in Australia, but I have a hypothesis that as prices come off their tops, we may well see some of that.
May well, and it may be part of the solution. I mean, I don't think blanket assessment of something being right or wrong is helpful at this point in time. I'm a big believer that we need to throw everything out on the table and do some really good risk analysis on each part of that and see what sort of solutions either in and of themselves or in hybrid models actually might come up with a long-term and sustainable solution for what is right now a very immediate and difficult crisis to deal with. Yep. And it's not, I have gone on a little bit about, all the factors that have led up to this and all those sorts of things. We've also got natural phenomena that have come into this in terms of the floods and just ignoring climate change and saying, well, it always floods in Lismore, so it's not that big a deal. It's a 1 in 100 year flood. It's a 1% chance every year that it's going to happen. So it's happened several times in several years. So we can't actually ignore that as a factor as well. That actually has to come into planning and opening up old flood plains for development is a very, very poor solution to what is a very big problem in an age where we are actually experiencing changes to our climate and has an effect on, people can't go back into some of those places. They're not going to be habitable ever again. And should they be rebuilt? Well, that's a big question that needs to be thrown onto a table and really talked about. Should they be rebuilt in those areas? Yeah,
well, we actually discussed that at some length in our previous show when you were looking at some of the areas around Brisbane. And I think it's a very important question because if we simply just replicate what we've done previously, but now with the new knowledge that we've got to say, hang on a moment, that doesn't make sense. But the alternative is, a very different sort of model of approval and control and planning and all those things. And again, that's another complexity. And I guess we keep coming back to this is a complex, multifaceted, really multi-headed problem. I want to add just one more thing to the mix here. This is from Edwin. Force the 1.2 million empty homes in Australia onto the market. So in fact, this is a bit of a thing that I've also been saying. We know that there are lots of vacant properties there across the country that aren't being lived in at the moment. Some of them have never been lived in, so people have bought them and just are holding them because they're just riding the value up. In other cases, they're vacant for other reasons. The question, I suppose, is would that go in some way to solving, to some extent, the rental crisis that we've got if we got more of those into the market in some way?
Well, I guess you'd have to wonder why they are remaining vacant. And for some people, it is better to not receive an income than to have the difficulties that they perceive come with having a tenant in a property, and all the challenges that sit around that. So is, part of the bigger discussion is it too difficult for individuals to own an investment property and too cumbersome and too much pressure on them? And that is part of a discussion that needs to be had. Is 1.2 million properties, that's going to go a long way to adding supply, depending on what the properties are and where they are, how much they are. But yeah, is that part of the solution? Absolutely, that would be one of the things. If I was chairing a round table on a discussion around that, everything I think should be on the table for discussion around those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. To my mind, it should be another of the factors that we should definitely be talking about, right? And but interestingly,
firstly, why are they vacant? What is the motivation? What is the strategy? And is there a solution that could actually be offered that takes away whatever the risk is that those owners perceive to be there if they did rent them?
And then going back to the census, we will get census data in a month or so, which will actually tell us what the current vacancy footprint is. But actually, it's very hard to get good data on vacant property across the country. There are people who spend a lot of time wandering around areas of, say, Melbourne and looking for the high-rise towers without lights and say, see, they're all vacant and not vacant. Yeah. Because
that's a fun Friday night.
Yeah, exactly. And another one that people have been looking at is water usage. So if the water usage is way lower than it should be, that's an indication of a lot of vacancies. And we know that in a lot of the high-rise developments, for example, around Docklands in Melbourne, a lot of those properties have never been lived in. It's pretty amazing.
Why?
Well, sometimes they're being held for long-term appreciation, all sorts of things like that. So again, it comes back to the more you think about this and explore it, the more complicated it becomes. Now, look,
the more opportunities there are too. I mean, just this discussion. Edwin says, well, here's all these vacant properties. Why? That needs to be part of a discussion around what are some of the potential solutions. There is no single silver bullet. And I think the complexity of how the issue has arisen is just a precursor to how complex it is going to be to solve. But there are probably multifaceted solutions that need to be explored with many different types of both legislative and practical pathways forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the fact is there's no one simple silver bullet solution. There's no one short-term incentive program that you can invent to solve this, right? This is a generation of a problem that's been created. But I guess the first point is we've got to recognise we've got the problem we got. And then secondly, try to put some of those things together to begin to actually sort of shape it into a solution. So that for me is the sort of the big question mark here.
Yeah, but with a long-term solution in mind.
It's got to be strategic in nature. It can't just be.
Most incentives are short-term.
Yeah, and it can't be just be in the 3-year, election cycle.
Cycle.
Yeah. Funny that. Doesn't help, does it, necessarily?
And not in line with public opinion polls. Oh, my God, I just want to throw them out the window. Yeah. You can't govern strategically, can't even plan as a business strategically if you've got a short-term assessment of your performance constantly coming in and banging your advisors on the back.
Well, actually, of course, it's not even 3 years because basically you have about 18 months to do things before you have to start planning for the next election. So it's pretty sad, really.
Let's fix that now.
Now, here's a question. At what point in the rental journey should you sit down with a financial advisor to plan a savings strategy? Interesting question.
Oh, what a great question. Yeah. That's really thinking quite well ahead. I think at any point in time, a discussion with a financial advisor is a really good thing to have, but finding one that's appropriate for your stage in life, and having a think about yourself. Well, where am I? Where do I want to be? Where am I in my career trajectory? All of those sorts of things are really good things to think about. And it's something that we teach in your first home buyer guide is having a little bit of a think about, is this right for me and so forth. in terms of when is the right time to save, I think discipline around saving is one of those key fundamentals that we should all be taught at school and at home through our as parents. We should be teaching this, because the discipline around saving is actually a cornerstone of how you build wealth over time, and how you have buffers, and how you make sure that you're not spending more than you earn. And look, we all go through that period of our lives where we spend more than we earn, but at some point in time, you've got to sit yourself back and have a really good hard look at what you actually want to do with your money. And if your life goal is to spend every cent that you earn, then great, go for it. But then don't perhaps then have that conversation with people. It's so hard to afford how to buy, hard to afford a house, or rent is so high, those sorts of things. So you can't have it both ways. The conversation with a financial advisor, I think, is really good to have well in advance of when you think you might want to go down that path of ownership if you want to do it, because it does take a long time to save, and it takes a lot of discipline to save. And there are different saving strategies that different people employ over time, whether they're accelerated or not accelerated with different opportunities. So I think even just having a conversation with yourself, if you've got a partner, around savings discipline is really, really important early on, because once you set up that discipline, then you're on a pathway, not just for property ownership, but other investment strategies as well.
Yeah, and that's very important, because you should see the property rental thing as part of an overall plan, right?
Yeah.
But
and it gives you something to work towards. If that is the goal, it
Yep.
actually gives you something to work towards, to say, by this time I want to have this much, by that time I want to have that much. And that's when I intend to start educating myself about the actual process of purchasing a property.
Yeah. Now, I've got one more question I want to bounce at you, and this is from Annie. This is again from the previous show. She's basically in long-term rental accommodation. She's been in it about 3 years, but she was given notice to say that the vendor owner of the property wanted to effectively ask her to move out, and the reason was they wanted to basically renovate the property and then go into Airbnb. And she was trying to understand whether she has any legs to stand on, or whether in fact, because of course there is a clause in the lease to say, well, you can give a notice at certain circumstances, including this, she hasn't really got anywhere to go. And, there isn't really much you can do, is there, I think, if in fact, under the terms of the lease, you can actually be asked to move on, despite the fact you may have a long-term agreement. There will often be break clauses and things in them.
Depends what state you're in. Certainly,
she was in Queensland.
Oh, in Queensland. Okay,
Yep.
So in Queensland, if and I guess it depends on where she is within the lease term as well. So if it's during a fixed term lease, then no, the owner can't give you notice to terminate the lease. That there aren't any grounds upon which they can do that. But if you're coming to the end of a fixed term lease, then the owner can give you 60 days notice to vacate, and without grounds is a reason.
So that's where she is. So she went through the fixed term, and now she's on the sort of
towards the end.
Towards the end,
yeah. So no, the owner. There may be changes to that legislation coming in from October, where there are only certain grounds. And this is not legislated yet, but the proposal is that there will be only certain grounds upon which the owner can end a fixed term agreement at the end of the fixed term, not during the fixed term, but at the end of the fixed term with prescribed notice periods. And that is, renovation to the property, owner moving in, family moving in, sale of property. So there's certain under the tenancy reform agenda, there's going to be a limited number of reasons that an owner can end a fixed term tenancy at the end of the fixed term tenancy.
But once you've got to the end of it, there isn't much you can do, and it shows you the dilemma in terms of if you're in a rental environment, are
it's that security question,
correct,
isn't it?
It is.
That long-term security.
Yeah.
And when you've got a private investor, then they have that ability to make a decision as to what they're going to do with that property, as long as they're not breaching any of the terms of the tenancy.
Yeah, and you can see it from their perspective. If they're effectively looking at it as an investment and they're trying to maximise the investment return on the property, you can sort of get it. You can understand why they do that, but then it has the consequences back on the on the tenant, and the tenant's got to find something else to live, and all the disruption. Another person who sent a question in said, I've had to move, say 4 times in the last year because of things just happened. In some cases, the quality of the accommodation wasn't appropriate, and they didn't do the repairs. And another one, they were given notice to move on. So again, I want to underscore this sort of sense of insecurity. I see it coming through quite a lot in people who are actually in the rental sector. And so again, it goes back to this dilemma. Do you try then and steer yourself towards buying a property, even if it's not necessarily in the right area, or you commit yourself, or do you actually deal with these other this is the complexity. It is such a difficult nut to crack. It is not a straightforward
question. Yep. And again, there are circumstances where tenants are in long-term tenancies and their circumstances change and they want to end that tenancy early. So it can go in both directions, can't it, when people's circumstances change. And look, I would encourage, if she can, to see if she can negotiate for a longer period, even if it is at a higher rental, until she finds a property to move to, because it's very difficult at the moment to find rentals in particularly in Brisbane, but southeast Queensland. And there may be a middle ground that you might be able to come to an agreement with the owner on to have more time there.
Yeah, and I think you made a really important point. I always say to people, the best thing to do is keep on a good relationship. Yeah. Right? Keep communicating, keep talking.
Remember, they're human beings too. Both sides of this equation are human.
Exactly. What often happens, in my view, is that sometimes the relationship sours and you sort of end up chucking letters at each other or whatever, rather than actually trying to find a solution that actually might be a win-win. And so
and they do exist. We've seen people with steady heads actually come to a really good outcome that is the right set of compromises for both sides of the equation, but it doesn't often. Well, no, I'm going to put it out there. It never comes from trying to be the winner. Yeah, it just doesn't happen, because human nature is to say, if you're going to push me, I'm going to push back.
Correct. Yeah, and that's actually often the case. You end up trying to stand on your principles, right? Yeah. And sometimes the right answer is to just bend a little and understand that there's another party involved here, and finding an appropriate solution that may be a win-win is actually the right way to deal with it. But that's a very difficult thing to do when you're in the middle of it. But actually, quite often,
and your home is an emotional place.
Absolutely right.
It does. It absolutely brings out emotional responses from people. And I've heard property managers deal with tenants on the phone, just really distressed and upset, but taking their anger out on the individual who answers the phone, and then taking a deep breath and going, you know what, I've just got so much going on. I'm sorry I yelled at you, and starting the conversation again. And sometimes that's a good place to go, is to just go, you don't know what else is going on in other people's lives when they're going through difficult times. And it's not just always about that situation that's causing them anxiety and stress. It's often a whole lot of other factors that come into it. And if you can get a level head and have a good conversation, sometimes the outcome can be far better than expected.
Yeah, and Jason makes this point, and thanks for the super chat, Jason, really appreciate it. Sadly, the division between the haves and the have-not seem to be increasing. He said, night all. Cheers to me and to you, Meighan. Hope we got rid of keeping wages low, CPI going up and interest rates lifting. Consequence of past government was my hope. Wages should go up $1 a week with inflation. So there you go.
What in there?
Message received, Jason. Thank you very much, and thanks for the super chat. It really is greatly appreciated. And I think you make some very, very important points there. We have to find a different way to think about this. I've said
we do. And it might not be the traditional way of thinking about it.
Exactly.
And I don't know what that is, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't explore all the options, all of them.
Yeah. And from Jeff, whole situation doesn't sound very optimistic. We're really good, thoughtful people in control. Instant gratification will be destructive. Yeah, that's probably right. Again, we need long-term thinking. We need strategic thinking, right? and strategic thinking and politicians don't go too well together, do they?
Certainly haven't in recent years.
Well, look, I want to say, Meighan, thank you very much for spending the evening with us. Really enjoyed speaking with you and getting your insights. If people want to know more about you and what you do, where do they go?
They can head to propertypursuit.com.au. We're a Brisbane-based company, or on the first-time buyer side of things, homebuyeracademy.com.au. That's where you're going to learn a lot about the process of buying property.
Terrific. And I do recommend that Buyer Academy. There's some really...
Actually, pop onto the podcast. Forgot to mention that. It's also your First Home Buyer Guide podcast. Free resources. Great fun. Veronica and I have an unbelievably good time sharing stories about what we've learned over our time, 45 years of being in the property industry.
And what I find remarkable is that the insights are very profound, but also there's a simplicity to the dealing with it as well, which I really love. So, all power to your elbow.
So good to talk to you again.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take you offline and close the show. See you later. Bye-bye.
See you later.
Well, there you go. Hope you found that interesting, folks. A very, very important conversation. I'll be doing some more shows over the next couple of weeks on other dimensions around the rental conundrum and trying to shift some of the conversation forward to hopefully begin to think about how we can solve some of these things. Anyway, before I go, I should just tell you that next week, Damien Classen's coming back, end of the month. Talk about investing now. So the markets are crashing. Where are we going? What's going on? So we're going to get some insights from Damien. So mark your diary and join us next week. And that should be a very important conversation again. A lot going on there too. And meantime, if you have the odd moment, pop on the channel and see some of our recorded shows. We do them up most days at the moment. A lot going on there too. So thank you very much for spending time with us this evening. Really appreciate it. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Cheerio.